All right, welcome to Halitics. I'm Hal Ginsberg. So glad to be talking today. It's Wednesday. Chuck, I always got to look at my computer clock to know what day it is, and even then, it doesn't even show the day. It just shows the date. So I'm always at a loss. Did you know it was Wednesday?
Actually, I did, but I have to work at it.
Well, good for you. Chuck is outside Chicago. He is our man, if you will, in kind of Chicago, in the Chicago metro. Are you in the metro area? Would you call it that?
Oh yeah, I'm in Chicago every day. I mean, I spent my first 2 days, Sunday and Monday, at what was called Progressive Central, and that's a gathering of progressive voices and representatives across any number of issues. And that was brilliant. That was at the Chicago Teachers Hall, which is in the heart of Chicago, and just outside the bubble of what is the gathering of the Democratic National Committee, the Convention Center, which is the United Center. And that's where it's a huge arena. It's where the Chicago Bulls play. And there are two rings around that arena, a red barrier and then a yellow barrier. And we won't get too deep. I mean, I'll do follow-up questions, but in any case, there are two parallel conventions going on. Progressives, that's primarily why I came to town. And then there's the Democratic Party itself, their convention.
Yeah, let me see if I can get this image up here. It's not great, but there's the United Center, and it's got the title of the program. And I mentioned, I titled it is provocative. Dems pour gasoline on Gaza and funeral pyre. Your focus is more as an advocate for single-payer health care. You're the president of one-payer states. Chuck, you're a friend of the show. You've been on before. I was really pleased and impressed that you also brought up the genocide in Gaza when you met with a couple of the more progressive Democrats. So I thank you, first of all, for doing that and for all your advocacy for, I'm going to just say, I believe what you're working for ultimately is poor, struggling, and working Americans to make life a little bit better for people who are not doing as well as they should be doing.
Yeah. Well, I want people to do wonderfully better. I mean, I have a vision, you might call it a utopian vision, of universal transformational justice for all. And that's every social justice issue. We're not going to win healthcare justice until we join arms with people who are fighting for housing and peace and diplomacy and education, climate remediation, you name it. I mean, every issue needs to be on the table, and we cannot exclude any of these social justice campaigns and efforts. Nobody wins unless everybody wins, in my view.
100%. 100%. Now, I center on Halitics, or I have been at least since the beginning of the genocide, the latest iteration and the most bloody, the most violent iteration of it by Israel on Palestine on October 7. What is happening there? So I'm going to try to briefly discuss it. Just the past 24 hours, I feel I have an obligation morally to discuss it. So you can see, despite the talk of a ceasefire that President Biden mentioned yesterday in his speech, and I'll have some segments of it, despite the fact that Vice President Harris, the nominee, or to become the nominee in tonight, I guess. Is it tonight or tomorrow? I'm so confused. Do they end tonight or tomorrow, Chuck?
Tomorrow, Thursday, the 22nd. That's the last day of the 4-day convention.
So she's talked about ceasefire, and I think Biden even said that Israel's agreed to the ceasefire. They killed 50 more. Israel killed 50 more Palestinians yesterday. Well, I think there are over 41,000. This is, I think this is the worst we've seen since the Nazis, to be perfect. Well, no, that's not fair, because we had the Houthis and the Tutsis. But in the 21st century, this is probably the worst genocidal record we've seen, and it so upsets me. I can't tell you enough how upset I am by this, Chuck.
Yemen is somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000. The United States has armed Saudi Arabia against the Yemenis. That's a horrific event as well. So, I mean, there are a number of genocides going on around the world, not to diminish, of course, what's happening here, but let's keep things in, global perspective here, that this is a global phenomenon, not just confined to the Middle East.
I appreciate your bringing that Yemen up. I have not read about Yemen being put in the same list with Sudan, Darfur, Israel, and also just the death count in Ukraine. So is that Myanmar also is a very, very deadly place right now for the Rohingya people. Is the media not telling us about Yemen at all? Or is that just something we're not being kept apprised of?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the you and your audience probably know this is that it took Bernie Sanders joining arms with, of all people, Mike Lee of Utah, to Republican hard right conservative, to call for an end to U.S. Financing and militarizing that conflict on behalf of the Saudis, who are themselves complicit in genocide. So not many hands are clean around the world right now. And again, that doesn't let any one group off the hook. It puts everybody in the conversation, and we need to talk about it all, I think, to be really comprehensive and not selective in our own right. We need to not do what the media does, which is to focus in on something that is going to sell more, more eyes. It's going to sell more product, in the U.S. media market, because Israel is arguably the 51st state, right? I mean, Israel has a universal healthcare system. We don't. Israel is massively tax subsidized by U.S. taxpayers, and on top of that, we've been pouring tens of billions of dollars on top of our phenomenal military aid to begin with, and at no point has it. Only at one point was it suggested. It was a green line, a red line actually, that the Israelis violated in southern Gaza, and the Israelis just kept pushing forward. So they know that the U.S. Is not serious when we talk about restricting weapons or defense weapons only, or conditioning weapons sales and so forth, like Bernie has been saying and other members of Congress. So it's a tangled issue, and I think it's worth going in and having that serious discussion. But the compelling nature of this, and the picture you have on the screen, is that these are our tax dollars. We are complicit. We are complicit in this mass murder, and what you refer to as a genocide, and I do agree with that as a definition. Just go back to the Genocide Convention of December 8th, 1948. If anybody wants a reference point for what it is that defines genocide, go look at the Genocide Convention of December 8th, 1948, and they'll know what we're talking about.
Chuck, well, first of all, explain the picture. Who is in that picture? You don't need to identify them by name, but just what was the ideology of that image?
So these are folks who on Monday had been protesting from about 12 noon to at this point about 3:30. This is about 3:30 in the afternoon, and this is in the hall of the Chicago Teachers building. This is about 6-8 blocks away from Union Square. Union Square is the space that the Chicago police have determined that's where the protesters can exercise their free speech, but effectively cannot step outside of that zone without violating what the Chicago authorities have determined is the safe space, or the free speech space. So when they came into this hall here, a handful of blocks away, a police officer suddenly showed up about a half hour after they arrived. And I don't know if I sent that picture to you, but there's a picture of a police officer talking to representatives of this group. These are folks from all over the country. This is just a sampling of the many thousands who have gathered in Chicago. And on that same day, as I understand it, there were about 8 of them who did break out of Union Square and did penetrate the red line, which is the first security circle around United Center. There's also a yellow line or a yellow barrier. Nobody's cracked inside of that. And those 8 individuals were detained. They were taken into custody. I don't know their legal status at this point, but these are folks who want serious attention, obviously focused on the what the United States is complicit in supporting, which is Israel's mass murder of primarily women and children, innocents, people who are not armed, people who are seeking refuge in hospitals, in schools, in community centers, and their entire society has been largely obliterated, and it's not stopped.
Did you now you met with a couple of representatives? There's Congressmember Khanna from California, right, and I really appreciate this pick. And here's one of Representative Jayapal from Washington State. Did they see that that banner that you were holding up, "Not Another Bomb"? And whether they saw it or not, did they address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza?
It was not part of their program assignment as it was, and I don't believe they saw that. I don't believe they were in the room at that time. I was on a healthcare panel with Pramila Jayapal, who you saw in that second picture. And for your audience who don't know, Pramila from Seattle, Washington, is the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and she's also the lead sponsor of the National Expanded and Improved Medicare for All legislation in the House. And Ro Khanna in the second picture is, or the first picture I think you put up there, is the prime sponsor of the legislation that we are centered on, which is the State-Based Universal Health Care Act, HR 6270. And adding to that, I just make mention that Senator Ed Markey just introduced a Senate companion to that bill. It's Senate Bill 4817 or S4817. So it's HR 6270 and then S 4817. But but to answer your question, they were not directly addressing foreign policy in their comments. They weren't asked to, and I don't think that they got any questions from the audience on that. I know that both of them did come out and support the ceasefire, the Cori Bush resolution, which also calls for pointing toward establishment of a Palestinian state. So they're both on board, our Representative Khanna and Representative Jayapal. But they did not directly address those particular topics in their comments. On the second day of the Progressive Central Conference, and this is a conference that preceded the actual Democratic Convention, Representative Jayapal came in and gave another address on behalf of the CPC, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and she went down the litany of issues that are prioritized by the Congressional Progressive Caucus heading into the next congressional session, 2025-26. And there was no mention of Gaza there. And what's interesting in terms of the priorities, after 3 years of highlighting the Medicare for All bill, universal health care, it's not in their priority list going into 2025-26. So I feel like in some ways we're backtracking.
Yeah, but I'm just going to jump in. That's where I'm feeling too. And we're going to I'm going to try not to too much interweave healthcare and Gaza and try to keep them separate, although I'm responsible for it. But you brought up healthcare. You're a universalist, but I know you're working with one-payer states, you're the president of one-payer states, and the goal there is to at least get state-based Universal Healthcare Act passed so we can focus on getting some of the more progressive states perhaps to pass their version of Medicare for All, single payer, however you want to call it. I'm exactly there with you, Chuck. I am more despondent, less hopeful, less optimistic, and I never was very about the possibility of the Democrats uniting behind any kind of single payer plan. This is from August 12th, New York Times. I just wanted to put this up on screen for folks. And you can see there the Democratic strategy is to demonize Trump, to point out how awful Trump is. And he is, right? I mean, we're not arguing that. He is terrible. But does that make it okay for the Democrats to be just marginally less awful? And my answer to that is, for so many voters, it is. And you can see here from that same Times article, Harris back in 2020, when Bernie Sanders looked like he was the favorite to become the nominee, she embraced a much more progressive vision, not one that she governed, not one that I've seen in her actual, accomplishments, but one that she spoke about 4+ years ago. But she told the Times as recently as 2 weeks ago, or in July, rather, that she doesn't support single payer. Does that make it more challenging, do you think, to even get Sabuka through Congress?
No, not necessarily. We've had this sort of philosophical discussion. I've been at this work since I was 13. I turned 65 next month. I've been doing this now for 52 years, social justice organizing. And I look at opportunity. That's how I focus on this work. I'm an opportunity-focused person. And that's why I'm not only the president of One Pair States, I'm also the founder of a group called Justice for All Network. Justice for All Network. And that's an effort to bring everybody together. And we do intergenerational summits. But to answer your question, Kamala came out and supported Bernie's bill because she was running for president in 2020. I mean, let's keep it real. And she was catering to the progressive base of the party, which has disproportionate influence during the primary season. And any number of the other supporters or those who signed on with Bernie's bill did exactly that as well. Cory Booker is another good example. So I'm not extremely critical of Kamala Harris. I see her as, a politician who's looking, who is opportunistic. I'm opportunistic. I'm ambitious. She's ambitious. We're focused on getting to different places by different means. I have a vision of a future where we can all live in a world of justice, a utopian world. Politicians look from election to election, right? That's how they operate. Their job is to get elected and reelected, elected and reelected. And the rationale is that if you don't get elected or reelected, you can't do anything. So hers is a calculus. And I'm actually more encouraged that she's at the top of the ticket with Tim Walz, for all their faults, than if it were to be Joe Biden and Kamala Harris running for reelection. Joe was at every level a declining candidate and president, just in terms of his, let's just say, his stand-up performance and his ability to convince people that he had the capacity to go on for 4 more years. So my first thought process with this election, as I've mentioned to you before, is anti-fascism. And that's what Trump represents. And that's what he represents in denying, but of course promoting, the Project 2025, which is the entire array of the fascist agenda. This comes out of the Heritage Foundation. I'm probably steering into another set of topics here, but I look at this collectively. I look at the issues overall. And, on balance, I'm actually more encouraged today than I was a month ago.
All right, let me just address some of what you said, not necessarily pick it apart or argue with you, but just, I think you're being a little bit unfair to yourself to say that you and Harris are both ambitious. I think it's true, but your ambition, as you've stated, but also that I can state myself from observation and from working with you for years, Chuck, is your ambition is to make life better for people, is as you've stated. But her ambition seems to be, and this seems to be that of the Democratic Party elites at a minimum, the candidates, to placate the billionaire class, to placate special interests, not to do what's best for the American public, except pay lip service to what they believe American people want to hear. And I base that statement in part on what you told me before we went on air. I'd like you to explicate how there's really 2 conventions. There's the convention for the ordinary people, and then there's the convention for the people with money.
Right. And those are the ones, as I mentioned to you, who spend $1 million a night to reserve those suites in that sports arena. This is where the Bulls play. It's a huge sports arena, but they plunk down $1 million and they get to host people come in through the convention and they have the conversation about, let's talk about helping out my interests, in the case of the billionaire class, in the case of these corporate CEOs. So there is that going on, and there's no denying it, that the Democratic Party, going back, I would even go back to the Carter years, but certainly the Clinton years, and say that, the Democratic Party at that time went on bended knee to Wall Street and started doing their bidding in a way that created a massive jealousy on the part of the Republicans. That's why they were so furious with Clinton. That's why they wanted to impeach Clinton, because he had stolen their playbook. That was the ironic thing of it all. But, Joe Biden also, to give him credit, the first 2 years of his presidency delivered more progressive steps than any modern president. Now, that was a result of Bernie and our progressive movement pushing him and making him do these things to lift huge numbers of children out of welfare. That was a big step. Personally, I'm somebody who had $53,000 in student loan wiped away. $53,000.
Isn't that amazing? Was that your loans or your child's loans?
No, those were mine.
Isn't that amazing that a man who's now eligible for Social Security, although they've raised the age to 67 for full benefits, but eligible 40 years after, more than 40 years at that point after college, and you still owe student debt. To me, this is an indictment of the system beyond, again, I started to lose words because it just seems so awful and so wrong to me, Chuck.
Right. There's no question about it. My former boss, Paul Simon, not to be confused with the musician, former Senator Paul Simon of Illinois, one of the dearest people I ever met in politics. He and Ron Dellums, Congressman Ron Dellums, going back many years when I was a student at Cal Berkeley. Those were two of my inside mentors, I would say, electeds. Paul was the #1 advocate for education, and he said, and correctly, that every dollar invested in education produces $7 of positive feedback for society. It's the single best investment we can make, education. And when we saddle young people especially, and also their parents, their grandparents, their aunts, their uncles, their cousins, people are helping them get through, they take out these private bank loans, they're screwed. They're screwed. All of my loans came through the Department of Education, thankfully. That's where the loan forgiveness comes, not through the banks. The banks are not going to forgive loans. So for that, I did my undergraduate when it was $750 a year. When I went back to graduate school 7 years later, education costs had just skyrocketed. And by the time I was done with my PhD, I was buried in debt. My debt was up to almost $90,000, and I spent those 30 years or so whittling it down to $53,000. But still, that's a life changer when somebody wipes out that debt. And so I'm grateful for that. I'm not going to hide behind that. I'm grateful that Joe Biden did that. The board, the floor is that you have to pay the minimum for at least 10 years. And then you're eligible for forgiveness, 10 years. So my kids are not 10 years out of school yet, so they're not eligible.
Well, I just want to say I'm grateful too, then, that your situation has improved because of that. As a friend, I want you to be, feel secure. And obviously having that debt is a problem. So I'm glad that was resolved. And I also appreciate your explaining how the debt was as significant as it was. The forgiveness was as significant after you mentioned that you had attended Cal, because at that time it would seem hard to me, if not impossible, to ring up a very significant debt, because back in the 60s, college was much more affordable for middle class, if not working class Americans.
Absolutely. But by the time I went back to school, and this is now at the University of Colorado, that's where I got my master's and PhD, the public school costs had skyrocketed at that point. They had just gone up radically. And that's where I incurred all that. And by the way, that was while I was also working full time. I mean, I was doing political consulting work. I was teaching. I was a teaching assistant. It wasn't like I just sat back and took in these loans. I continued to work. I've never stopped working. That was the one thing my dad instilled in me, was this work ethic. Well,
you were doing the wrong things. You were educating others. You were trying to bring enlightenment to people rather than, I don't know, being an investment banker or a corporate lawyer, starting a software company, then you'd be golden, right? I mean, you help a corporation move, or you advise a corporation to move offshore its operations, you'd have plenty of money, Chuck.
Oh, for sure, for sure. I went on. I was, I think I've told you. I know I have. That I was organizing graduate students back in the day. That got me in hot water. Ended up having to write 2 dissertations to get my PhD. Unheard of. I've never met anybody who had to write 2 books, 2 dissertations. And then I continued to organize students, and then I continued to organize young faculty when I moved into the ranks. And then I was organizing full-time faculty when I got to University of the Arts in Philadelphia, and I was fired from there for union organizing. We won the union, no regrets, but higher education's environments become extremely toxic. But as far as doing the right or wrong thing, of course I was doing the right thing. I was cultivating and teaching civics, really quality teaching of civics to young people who have had that taken away from them. The K through 12 curriculum is just strip mine civics education. So is it any wonder that people are confused and angry about the political system because they don't have a clue as to how it works? Our education system has failed them. And that makes them ripe for the picking for the fascist Republicans to just pick them off, play on their ignorance. And I don't mean that in a mean way. Ignorance is simply a lack of knowledge. They just don't know. And then they're more easily, they play into the fear mongering and the othering of immigrants and Black and brown and indigenous and gay and trans folks. It becomes so much easier to finger point and blame them. And who's orchestrating this all from the top? It's the billionaire class who own the media landscape, right? Was it 5-6 companies own 90% of the media that we look at? And then it's the medical industrial complex, it's the military industrial complex where it all started. Eisenhower warned us of this with his farewell address in 1961. And little did he know that he was warning us about not just the military industrial complex, but all those other complexes that wrap around all these institutions in our society.
So are you arguing that one should at least seriously consider, if not actually vote, for Harris and other Democrats because they're the lesser of 2 evils? Or do you believe that they actually are going to do or try to do affirmative good? And I ask that question in part because my litmus test, people have often said to me, well, you won't vote for Harris, you're voting for Trump. And my answer is, I'm not going to vote for somebody who's going to make things worse. My first litmus test, and now I really have I heard a Jen Perlman who's running for Congress against Debbie Wasserman Schultz in Florida. And I tip my hat. Jen Perlman's a great candidate. I don't think she's going to win, sadly, but I really appreciate what she has to say. She said she is a single issue candidate now. She will not vote for a candidate who supports Israel unconditionally. And that's where I am too. I will not support Kamala Harris as long as she is part of the administration and she has not renounced their policy, which is support Israel at all costs. That said, I've also have a more general test, which is I won't vote for a candidate if I think they're going to make things worse. I didn't vote for Hillary in 2016 because I believed she would affirmatively make things worse. I voted for Biden in 2020 because I believed, I think I was wrong, we can disagree with that, he was going to make things better. I don't think he did. I don't think he tried to. That said, is it your view that even the most corporate Democrat is probably going to try to make things better than they were when they took office?
So I would say the jury's out on Kamala Harris, to be honest. She's still a work in progress. And think about, we're going to, I think, just agree to disagree on the first 2 years of the Biden administration, because I think actually Bernie made a huge mistake when he endorsed Biden way back, if you remember, in April of 2023. The process of challenging Biden through the electoral process was basically over. Think about that, in April of 2023, so that he was on cruise control. So he held one press conference in November, and the next one he held was like 6 months later. And people were shocked at the lack of mental acuity, his ability to stand up and deliver. And why wouldn't we be shocked? But the reality is that he wasn't challenged. And the first 2 years of his administration, he was challenged, and we made him do good things on climate. It wasn't enough, but it's a down payment. We made him do good things on education, not enough, but a down payment. We made him do good things in terms of child welfare, not enough, but we did it. We did a lot of good things around the pandemic. He did. Continued the rollout of free vaccines and masks and so forth. Look, and the credit should be with us, frankly. You know, we need to make them do it. FDR, back in the day in the 30s, he basically said, make me do it. And we did. For Biden, he didn't say it out loud, but we made him do it. The problem with Obama is that we gave him a free pass. We did not make him do good things. That was a problem. And why? I think largely, and this hopefully this doesn't come across as racist, but as the first Black president, progressives were told, back off, you know, give him all this space, give him all this latitude, and what did we get? We got the Affordable Care Act, which was neither affordable nor centered on care. I mean, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, it was not about patient protection. It was not about affordability. It was not about delivering healthcare. It was about securing Wall Street profits around the medical industry, primarily. And yet, the Wall Street Journal, the Democratic Party, to this day, refer to that legislation as universal healthcare, which is bunk. That's complete bunk, to this day. And that's the difference between FDR and Biden. On the one hand, we made them do it, and that's what we have to do with Harris. And with Obama, we didn't. So if people come at us after Harris, let's just, for argument's sake, say she wins, and people are going to say, "Oh, she's America's first, woman of color who's president. We need to give her all sorts of space and latitude. This is unprecedented."
She gets a pass. She gets a pass.
Yeah, the world's in crisis. We can't do this again. We can't repeat the mistake of the Obama years. And if you remember, for folks out there, Obama had the election locked up in September of 2008 when the economy went belly up. Remember, the housing bubble burst? The race was over. And more than 70% of Obama's contributions had been small donor contributions up to that point. And when the polls radically shifted and Obama clearly he was up more than 10 points up on McCain at that point, the Wall Street people, of course, they started throwing money at Obama, and he took it. And when he took that money, he also brought in an entirely corporate cabinet to replace his fairly progressive advisory cabinet, his campaign cabinet. And if that same thing repeats itself, with Harris, shame on us. Shame on us. That's what we have to take as the cautionary. We have to really make sure that we don't fall into this trap, which is a trap that's being set by the billionaire class inside the Democratic Party. And that billionaire class, by the way, has one foot in the Democratic Party and one foot in the Republican Party, and they're going to play both sides. So, the reality is that we've got to be alert, and we have to create a mass movement. And the only way to do that is to collect all of our social justice campaigns together and get over our single issue focus. Really, we've got to get over the single issue focus. I know that what's going on in Gaza is absolutely tragic, but there are so many other crises around the world. Again, that's not to diminish the significance of this genocide, which I agree with you on, and it's got to stop 100%. But I'm not a single issue voter, and I will be casting my vote for Harrison Walz in the fall.
I really appreciate that candor, the explanation, Chuck. I don't feel like I need to dispute with you, argue. I mean, we have our differences, and that's fine. I think we both respect the other's position. I get what you're saying. I want to pivot to Gaza in a moment. I know we've touched on, I have a couple of speeches, 3 speeches actually I want to play from, get your thoughts on. Before I do that, though, you are the president of one-payer states. The goal of one-payer states, the sort of the I guess your what's the word I'm looking, mission is to pass the state-based Universal Health Care Act and then really pressure states to enact Medicare for all. Or you're going to say, no, we don't even need Sabuca. They can already do it. But that's just part of that movement. No. Is that right?
Yeah. We want the SABUCA legislation. Again, the State-Based Universal Healthcare Act, SBUHCA, and that's HR 6270 and Senate Bill 4817.
So we've talked about, by the way, folks can learn all about this at onestates.org. One Payer States, www.onepayerstates.org. You see it on your screen. So here's my question. Are you making progress in any states or some states? Can you give us like hey, guess what? Look to Rhode Island in 2028 and we might really see this happen.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, just the first thing, I mean, everything you said was correct up to the point of our goal is to get a national, expanded, and improved Medicare for All system. That's our goal. So we call it Medicare for All through the states. In other words, we want states to model a system that can be taken to the national level, similar to how Canada did this through one province, Saskatchewan. That's how they got to national Medicare. And that's our theory of change. And that there are a number of states that have that chance of doing it, including California, Oregon, Washington, Minnesota, Maine, New York, maybe Massachusetts. New York might be the best position to make the biggest impact because it is a large population and the stars are aligned, except that they have a reactionary governor. We have to
say Hochul is a huge problem for you. I mean, no question.
Yeah. And also we need to convince the municipal unions. These are the New York City-based unions to support this legislation. Right now, they're resistant. And even though we do have, at least in terms of lip service and rhetoric, we have the majority of the Assembly, the Senate. The reality is that when push comes to shove and those labor leaders come into the back rooms and have conversations with the legislators they support, they say, we don't want you to vote for this. So a lot of politicians will sign on to be a co-sponsor of a bill, but when it comes right down to it, they're going to respond to pressures from their local power brokers, and that includes labor unions. So labor is a tricky one. And I'm saying that as a labor organizer. I mean, I'm a member of AFT, so I've got some street cred when it comes to this conversation. And my own union doesn't support single payer, the American Federation of Teachers. But to answer your question, those states that I rattled off, California, Oregon, Washington, Minnesota, Maine, and New York, are all primed and positioned to do something within the next 2 to 3 years. That's why we need to get this SABUCA legislation passed. And that legislation will allow those states that create universal healthcare systems to bring the federal dollars, the federal healthcare dollars, back to the states, and also give them a legal waiver so that they're not going to be caught up in court to move forward with creating a universal healthcare model. That's the idea, and that's what we're focused on. At the same time, we support the national bill, and we also support efforts to push back on privatization of Medicare. This radical privatization, for your audience, if they're not aware, the Medicare Advantage program is an absolute disaster. We call it Medicare Disadvantage because people are being hoodwinked by the insurance companies who are pulling people into this program, which shouldn't even be
and my understanding is that at least Biden was pretty open to pushing Advantage. Unfortunately, I hope that's not the case with Harris. And I think you answered this, but super quick, I've got a couple of comments I want to read to you from viewers. If you want to join us, you can, 240-242-5646. I'll take one call. So there's your incentive. If you want to get on quickly, call now. Maybe no one calls. And then I have some video clips for you. But have you heard, and you may have already answered this, has Harris commented at any point on SABUCA, on the states being a laboratory for Medicare for All?
No, and it has not. Frankly, we need to get that question pushed at her from mainstream media voice, somebody on the inside. Maybe we get Ryan Grimm, from The Intercept to do something along those lines. But we do need to get her on record. But LaFonza Butler, who succeeded her in the U.S. Senate, she's a temporary appointment U.S. Senator. I'm in conversation with her, Healthcare LA, and I think that may be the way we get to Harris, actually, because LaFonza was on her staff. They're very close, and I believe that she's primed to be a cabinet officer.
That's pretty smart, Chuck. That's good thinking. That's good networking or mapping out, because once she's out, you're going to be stuck with Schiff, and he's as corrupt as they come. All right, he's as shady as a $3 bill. Chuck, that's one guy I have one of the many Dems I have a lot of problems with. This is from Shade. He's very bright. He always has good comments, but I don't really understand this. Maybe you will. I don't know. Maybe you didn't write it correctly, Shade. To lower costs, I fear Medicare for all might degrade Medicare quality to Medicare for all quality and coverage. Junk food followed by reactive big pharma, reactive medicine is bad enough. I don't really understand that. Is he saying that he thinks that Medicare for all will kind of dumb down, or at least the top and the best care we get now won't be as good? I think that's what he's saying. Do you want to respond to that?
I mean, my best answer is take a look at the legislation. That's not in any way my interpretation. And it's not even an interpretation. It's what the bill says. And the bill is very clear. And the bill was put together by Pramila Jayapal, I think 5 years ago now. She brought together all of the stakeholders in healthcare. I mean, especially the progressive constituencies that we think about, unions and teachers and social workers and the unemployed and Black and brown indigenous communities and so forth. And they're all really quite happy with this legislation. So they certainly don't see it, and I don't see it.
And let me just throw a few things in there. The idea that Medicare is some kind of wonderful system is not really true. It's better than what most Americans have. But my mother-in-law has Medicare, and it doesn't cover her her hearing aids, which she absolutely needs. And those are very expensive and they're easily lost. They're not covered. She had to have oral surgery, which is often a problem, root canal or the dentures. She's very fortunate. She has all her teeth, or most of them anyway, but she had to have root canal and it wasn't covered. And that's thousands of dollars, Chuck. So it's okay. It's better than what most Americans have, but it's not comprehensive by any means.
Right. So Medicare is broken into part A, B, C, D, and traditional Medicare covers A and B, which is primary and hospital care. Primary and hospital care. Everything else is a bit of a crapshoot. And that's why this private insurance push for Medicare Advantage entices people into saying, oh, we'll get you covered for visual, hearing, right? Visual, mental, and they have all these packages that they push out there, and they give them low premiums, and people say that's great, plus I get swag, I get a gym, I get a free
purse, right? Yeah. No, I know. Yeah.
Right. But when people actually need mental, visual, hearing assistance, on top of the traditional Medicare, they're largely hoodwinked. They're not going to get it. So to the questioner's point, they do have a point that Medicare is insufficient as it exists, but that's why Pramila and Bernie's bills are called expanded and improved, because they pick up all of those other parts of our health
and one other point on this, and then I want to move. I got one other comment, but we can see from the experience in other countries that when there's comprehensive single payer care, virtually every other country, certainly every other wealthy country, provides better care. They get better results. They have healthier citizens at a greatly reduced cost per person.
Absolutely. I mean, we're paying 18% of our economy, GDP, and I think the Swiss are at 11%. The Germans are at 8 or 9%, and so forth. So we're paying on average twice or three times as much as these countries. Japan pays 6%, and
I was going to say Germany and Switzerland aren't the best either. They're good. They're much better than we have. But Japan and France are probably about as good as it gets, and they're cheaper compared to those other two countries. UK is good, but UK has been cutting back on their support for the National Health Service, and that's very unfortunate.
Right. And the country that we look to model ourselves after more than any actually is Canada, just to the north. And Canada does have deficiencies. We need to be honest about that. They have what's called global budgeting, so that if you have an elective procedure, a non-life-threatening procedure, toward the end of the year, you need a knee replacement, you're going to get bumped into the following year. You are going to be in a waiting line. So let's keep it real. And they do not have universal dental or visual care. And so it's important to acknowledge what's real and not try to gaslight people or mislead people, but to be absolutely 100%. But Pramila and Bernie's bill actually looks to go above and beyond Canada. They acknowledge those problems. So actually, if we adopt their legislation, we will have among the best healthcare systems in the world, actually.
I did want to move on, but this is so important. I agree with everything you said, Chuck. And I would just note, I really like the concept behind the Canadian system. I'm certainly not a libertarian in any way, but I like the idea of doctors being independent, which is the way Canada works. They work as independent contractors with the Canadian government, and then they send in the invoices. And I really like that. You know, it appeals to me, but I've heard a lot of people say this, the NHS, what they have in the UK is better, where doctors are employees of the government. That doesn't sound as good to me, but I'm open to the idea. But personally, I love the idea of doctors being independent, but the patient goes to the doctor and then the doctor bills the government. I think that seems to me the best way, if it can be. But you're right. Canada has deficiencies. It's more expensive and the outcomes aren't quite as good as in other countries.
And yet, ask a Canadian, they wouldn't trade their system for ours ever.
All right, and one other comment real quick from Emogi. Emogi is more on my side of that divide. Vote for Kamala, don't vote for Kamala. Emogi says, hey, unless there's a ceasefire, I don't think we should vote for the Dem. So they're just another view I wanted to share that I saw in there. Chuck, we're running a little bit short of time, but I do want to at least play this clip. This is the I guess you call him the first gentleman candidate. I don't know. He's going to be the first gentleman? You're not really a candidate. Nobody votes for you. I don't know, but he will be the first gentleman if Harris wins. And I think she probably will, given the polls. This is Doug Emhoff. He's Jewish. I'm Jewish. I feel more comfortable criticizing him. Maybe you don't want to say anything, Doug, because you're not Jewish. I'm fine. Open season. I don't see it as an anti-Semitic issue, but I want to play this because I was offended by this statement, actually.
Okay.
But Kamala has fought against anti-Semitism and all forms of hate her whole career. She's the one who encouraged me as second gentleman to take up that fight, which is so personal to me. And those of you who belong to blended families know that they can be a little complicated. But as soon as our kids started calling her Mamala, I knew we'd be okay.
All right, so he said he was going to say, I knew we'd be okay. And the whole sort of like the cutesy thing with the Mamala, and then juxtaposing that with this is a personal fight, I'm Jewish, and this is personal to me. I find that very offensive, Chuck, and I'll explain why personally.
Sure.
This is an incredibly privileged man. This is an incredibly wealthy person. His life is so much better than just about anyone else on the planet. His wife is a heartbeat away from the presidency. She is very likely to become president. The Jewish state, the self-professed, self-proclaimed Jewish state, is right now, I won't use the word genocide for this, right now killing willy-nilly in the tens of thousands Palestinians, Gazans, with zero justification whatsoever. These are women, children. And he's centering anti-Semitism as the issue that's personal to him. I went through that whole speech. That's all I'm going to show. He never once mentions Palestinians. He never once mentions Gazans. I want my leaders to show empathy, compassion for people who are not well off, who are not like them, who are not. I don't want his personal fight to be about him. And that really, really pissed me off.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's what he was instructed to speak on. I don't think he did that independently.
Wait, is that a good excuse though? Is that he just was following orders? I don't know. I'm going to have.
I'm not
Problems with that.
in any way forgiving it. I'm just giving you the context of what my best guess is. And it's way more than anti-Semitism. In fact, I think it's largely a false canard. It's being weaponized to shut down opposition. It's being to shut down free speech. And, you know, we talked at the top of the hour here. I went to Cal Berkeley. That was the home of the free speech movement. Give me a break, you know? And back in the early 60s, people across the political spectrum, I mean, across the political spectrum, supported free speech on campus. And now you have a replay in Columbia of what we saw in 1968, which is calling the cops onto campus and start pulling students out of buildings and start slamming on students. And this is crazy, but this is the world in which we are. And then, of course, you know, the Democrats need to stand up to the Republicans in the Congress who were weaponizing it again. And of all people, some of the most anti-Semitic members of the Republican caucus are out there declaring themselves, you know, pro-Semitic and pro-Israel and so forth. And for the Democrats to let them get it is ridiculous. But there's so much more to unpack here, really, when you think about it.
100%. I just want to throw something out because you said a lot of things are super true. The weaponization so offensive is that you use the no question documented history of anti-Semitism that led to one of the greatest crimes that humanity has ever committed, and using that to justify your own crimes, your own bad behavior, and distract from the reality on the ground.
Frankly, and
that really pisses me off again.
Well, and I believe it's offensive to most Jews in this country who oppose.
I think it also creates more anti-Semitism. People.
Yeah, no, it's totally counterproductive. It plays into the right-wing narrative, which is getting us closer to fascism. And I just think it's idiotic politics, and it doesn't make any sense at any level.
Here's another Jewish man speaking, and then we're going to close. In terms of the videos, I have one of President Biden, who I think was better. I want to be, I try to be fair here. I try not to just present my evidence that supports my view. We'll play from President Biden as well, who I think was better than Emhoff and Schumer, but still was inadequate in his comments. But we'll play that. But first, Schumer, real quick.
Let me close on a personal note. As the highest-ranking Jewish elected official in American history, I want my grandkids and all grandkids to never, never face discrimination because of who they are. But Donald Trump, this is a guy who peddles anti-Semitic stereotypes. He even invited a white supremacist to Mar-a-Lago. Tonight, folks, I am wearing this blue square to stand up to anti-Semitism, to stand up to all hate. Our children, our grandchildren, no matter their race, no matter their creed, their gender or family, deserve better than Donald Trump's American carnage.
All right. So again, what all sorts of things there real quick, but the blue square, I tried to figure out, I don't know what the hell the blue square is. This guy is so powerful. He's one of the rich, not that rich maybe, but super influential, powerful man. He admitted, he said, he's the majority leader of the Senate. Again, and there was not one mention of Gaza. I looked through that speech, not one mention of Palestine, centering his own privileged ass over families that are being starved.
Yeah, it's unconscionable. And again, I think it's just on the face of it, a poor political calculus. It just doesn't make sense. Just setting aside the moral question, it's stupid politically. But absolutely, this is why Palestinians feel like they're being erased, that they don't exist, they're not being seen. And I think that's when the speeches and the rhetoric gets better. But remember, we are talking about two conventions here, and all these speeches are calculated to play to audiences. And when you play it so hard in the direction of anti-Semitism, you alienate an entire population of people who are looking at the big picture, including Jews, American Jews, who know that this is much more complicated and in some ways not complicated. It's not that complicated to understand that what we're seeing now is tantamount, or actually, I believe it is. Again, look at the Genocide Convention of December 8th, 1948. That's where I square my thinking. So anybody who has this abstract discussion about anti-Semitism, let's square up on what the Geneva Convention said. And by the way, on December 10th, the day after that, was the passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So two of the most important documents in human history, December 9, December 10th, 1948, pointing out evil, genocide, and ultimate good, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thanks, Hal.
All right, before we let you go, here's the, or do you have to go? Or are you good?
Go.
So I have this, I want to let listener know, don't worry, we're not going to play the full speech. He went on for over 50 minutes. I mean, everyone else was talking for like 5-6 minutes. I didn't watch it, but I took a snippet, and I'm not going to comment. I'm going to play it. I'm going to stop, and then I'll ask for your thoughts, Chuck, and then I may have a response, and I'll let you have the last word. But so we're just about done with Halitics. Thanks so much for watching, and please click like, please click subscribe. Here's President Biden last night in Chicago.
In the Middle East. As you know, I wrote a peace treaty for Gaza. A few days ago, I put forward a proposal that brought us closer to doing that than we've done since October 7th. We're working around the clock, my Secretary of State, to prevent a wider war and reunite hostages with their families and surge humanitarian health and food assistance into Gaza now. To end the civilian suffering of the Palestinian people, and finally deliver a ceasefire and end this war. Those protesters out in the street, they have a point. A lot of innocent people are being killed on both sides. Just as we worked around the clock to bring home wrongfully detained Americans and others from Russia.
All right, so yeah, I cut it off there because then he moved on. But I did want your take, and maybe you can see why I was certainly much less offended by that. But how do you feel about what Biden said?
Right. Well, when he talks about a peace plan, he's talking only about a ceasefire. And until you get to the root causes of what are the fundamental injustices between the Israelis and the Palestinians in particular, but it also involves numerous other countries across the Middle East. And this is fueling the prospect that the war is going to expand, as it is, into southern Lebanon, and the prospect of a larger regional war with Iran, which is really quite dangerous. And you have an unrestrained Saudi government. So it's a bigger picture. You've got to dig in and create a regional peace plan. A regional peace plan that puts it at the very center of the establishment of a Palestinian state. And he's not talking about that. He's made reference to that in the past, but until you actually do that, until you establish sovereignty for the Palestinian people and self-determination for other folks across the Middle East who have been sidelined, marginalized, dehumanized, until you're actually doing that, you're not a peacemaker. You're simply getting just a sort of a temporary calm in hostilities. But we have to get to the root causes of this. It has to be understood systematically. That's what needs to be done. And for all of the talk about the Americans and diplomacy has taken a backseat to everything. And unfortunately, the weapons makers have got the inside track. I agree with Dennis Kucinich. We need a Department of Peace. We need an agency of government that is dedicated to actual diplomacy, not the State Department, which basically has become a front organization for the military industry, for the so-called Department of Defense, which of course used to be called the War Department which was more honest. But that's really what fundamentally, and my doctorate, my graduate studies are in the field of diplomatic history. So I know a little bit about this history, and until we're intentional and deliberate, and that's what we have to push Kamala Harris, assuming that she gets elected. But I don't take her election for granted. I still see the danger actually of fascism is very imminent. I don't think people should be relaxing at all here in this moment. But I think what we need to do is come together on all of our justice issues, having this conversation, supporting one another, and making sure that we get the peace we need. Because, without justice, there is no peace. Without justice, there is no peace. And that means if there's no justice in education, there's no peace. If there's no justice for housing, if there's no justice in terms of the conditions that give rise to war across the world, there's no peace. And fundamentally, in the last 10 years, roughly a third of the world has gone from authoritarian systems, a third of the world, to today, 2/3 of the world. So we've actually seen a doubling of authoritarian governments, mostly fascist, over the last 10 years. And you have to ask yourself why. And the reason why is that governments and leaders are not being leaders, and movements need to step up and make sure that justice is at the center of every conversation, that justice is the word that comes off our lips first, that justice is how we center our conversation on all of our human needs. And the Declaration of Human Rights is a great place to look. December 10th, 1948, the UDHR. That's my document. That's my go-to. That's how I keep this stuff in perspective. And that's how I vision the future. And that's how I keep myself calm, relatively, in the moment. And always appreciate you, Hal, and your thoughtfulness and your honesty. I think it's really a great conversation we have. Thank you so much.
All right. That's the last word. I just have one tiny little thing to add to what you said about keeping calm, keeping centered. One word. I'll give you 3 words: Bach, Mozart, Beethoven. And on that note, I guess notes, right? I've kind of moved into the classical realm because it does soothe the savage. Is it beast or breast? I think it's the savage. Music.
Beast.
Music hath charms to soothe the savage something. I'll let people know. Chuck, that was really beautiful. I appreciate it. Thank you. I appreciate you.
And to your folks listening, really, thanks for the thoughtfulness. Appreciate you. Stay in touch, onepayerstates.org, and just check us out and stay connected. This is a fight for more than just healthcare. It's for health across the board. Thank you.
All right. And I'll be back tomorrow. That is Chuck Pinocchio, great friend of the show. So proud and pleased to have him on Halitics.